Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm well, thank you, Rory. Thank you very much for asking. And thank you for joining us on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 213, lucky for some. And we're going to be covering three different topics today. And we're going to be starting off with counselling foundations. And that's when we look and recognize that the foundations that we kind of build our practice on are the strength of our practice. And today we're going to be speaking about relational depth. So it doesn't matter what level you are. You can be in training or you can have been qualified for 25 years. This is a topic that will interest you. Then we're going to focus on self. That's our second area today. And in Focus on Self, we look at you as being the heart of your practice. We as practitioners, we need to look after ourselves to be able to be there for others. And today we're going to be talking about failure. And this can be failure as a student. Maybe you have an assignment referred, but kind of what failure, even if you're a qualified practitioner and you face some kind of failure in your life or feel a failure in your practice, what does that look like? How do we deal with that? Because it does come up. And then we go into Practice Matters, where we dip our toe into the world of practice and we look at an element of practice or something we might see in our therapy room. And today we're going to be speaking about role play games in therapy. So there's an interesting one. And we had Daniel Hand, who did a lecture for us, I do believe, Rory, and who you met up with. And we've got an interview. So from an expert, we're going to be learning about role play in therapy. So episode 213, here we are. And it's a little bit different. And the reason it's different, if you listen to our podcast on a regular basis, you'll notice that the podcast goes into your ears. But prior to kind of starting the podcast this morning, Rory, I actually combed my beard. And the reason I'm doing that is because this podcast is now available on YouTube. The entire podcast. If you want to see what Rory and I look like, want to see what we get up to when we make our podcasts, then jump onto YouTube and just put in Counselling Tutor Podcast. And you'll find that we've started a new channel just for the podcast, and from here onwards we're going to be uploading our episodes so you can have it in your ears and you can have it in your eyes as well. We should use that as a marketing slogan, Rory.
Yeah, that's right. In your ears and in your eyes.
It sounds like bad shampoo. So let's start off. We digging into those counselling foundations, and we're speaking about relational depth, Rory. What is relational depth?
So that's a really good question. And relational depth is actually a theory that was developed by Mick Cooper and Dave Mearns in collaboration, trying to get a sense of how we connect with each other in a meaningful way. That's probably the best way of describing it. And I think what's really, really interesting with relational depth is that it doesn't just apply to therapy. Let me give you an example. I went out on my constitutional walk in my hometown just to get a little bit of air in my lungs and get a bit fitter. And I bumped into my neighbour, who is a Methodist minister. And we had a wonderful interaction, just talking about, existence and life. And at that moment, we were connected. And sometimes, there's a Gestalt word for it. It's called confluence, where you're not quite sure where you begin and the other person ends. And it was really meaningful. And it was almost like there was only the two of us in the world for that short space of time. That's my perception. His perception may be different, I have to say. And that is relational depth. It's moments of deep relating. And it's not modality specific. We talk about it in person-centered therapy, but actually it's in any interaction we have. And it's at that point where we're really seeing the other person and getting a visceral sense of who they are, Ken.
I like that. That's a lovely description of it. And I think relational depth is difficult to describe. When you've experienced it, you'll know it. Yes. And it's that vanishing. You vanish. You're no longer consciously being competent within the relationship. You're not concentrating on the theory you're using or the skill that you were using. You are just integrated with that client and then with you at real relational depth. It's almost a magical connection. And you can experience, as you say, Rory, relational depth or the same kind of feeling in other areas of your life. You might be focused on something, be super focused, and then look up and go, wow, where's the last hour go? You're connecting at a very, very deep level. You kind of lose yourself in what you are doing. So that, I guess, gives us an overview of relational depth. And I think a misunderstanding about relational depth is that it's a place that we aim to get to, so that you would start the counseling session, and then as the trust develops within the relationship, so you would move towards this magical place called relational depth. You're now there. You've kind of gone through the barrier and you're now in the relational depth. And that is where the rest of the session will take place, and the rest of the sessions with that client. But that's not how it is. Relational depth are moments where, and you will go in and out of that relational depth. It's not somewhere you're aiming to be and to take the therapy relationship. It just occurs when you and the client are kind of melding together, as you say, when you don't realize when you end and they start, Rory.
Absolutely. And I think that Mick Cooper in his blog sums it up beautifully. And one of the questions is, what is relational depth? And he says it's a state of profound contact and engagement between people. Our good friend Mick Cooper, of course, has done a lot of lectures for us. And I think that sums it up absolutely, exquisitely, Ken. And you're right, it doesn't happen all the time, but it kind of chimes. I used to say to my students, you'll feel it chime. Yeah. You'll feel a visceral a body sensation when you hit relational depth. And they used to come back and he said, we didn't know what you were talking about in the classroom until we've experienced it. And when we experienced it, it's like, whoa, it's almost like clang, like a bell clang, and you just feel yourself connected and ebbing and flowing within the relationship. It's a wonderful thing. And I think a lot of people experience that who are not therapists, to be honest, Ken. I think that you can have that in any walk of life, providing you put the person in front of you really at the center of your attention and the center of your universe, and that you're really deeply listening to them, that you tune into that person.
Yeah, there's no set of tactics for creating relational depth. Or maybe there is. That's an interesting one. Maybe there is. But the tactics are based in the forming of the relationship and the 100% being there with the person, as opposed to, if I use a specific kind of theory and say skills in a certain way, that's going to lead to relation depth. It's more about who we are within the relationship. So it's interesting that for relational depth with another human, which is what we're looking for at that deeper level in counseling, we look to ourselves, on our own, and how we can develop and put our stuff aside, because it's about really being there with that person. It's about the active listening. And if you go back over some of the foundation podcasts that we've done, we speak a lot about this, about who are you within the relationship? How do you form that relationship? Active listening within that relationship, and all of those kind of meld together. They create the trusting environment where that relational depth will occur. And you mentioned Professor Mick Cooper, who does so much work on relational depth, and he's done a number of lectures for us. Whether you're a qualified practitioner or a student of counseling, we have two different, offers. One for working professionals and one for students. The student offer that we have is called the Counselling Study Resource, and it's a paid for community with lectures and resources. And for qualified practitioners, we have what we call the CPD library, the Continuing Professional Development Library. And the relational depth lecture by Mick Cooper is in both of those libraries, because it is that important. And it spans both of those. So if you are a member of any of our libraries, go and check that out. Just go in, do a search for relational depth, and go and watch Mick Cooper speak about it, because he speaks with great authority. And I certainly learned a lot for that. And if you're not a member of either of those libraries, go to counsellingtutor.com, and there's some information there if you can have a look and see if that would be a fit for you. So if we thinking about relational depth, we're thinking about the key aspects that would create that. And we're saying again that they start with us as the therapist. We're going to be warm. We're going to be personal. We're going to show ourselves with that congruence, as it were, within the relationship, being our true self. And we're going to, there's a human element, isn't there, Rory? You have to really be yourself and not playing the part of the therapist within the relationship, I guess, in a way.
Absolutely. There's no part for facades or role play in relational depth. And I think there's a number of elements that help relational depth. First is the environment.
Yeah.
It has to be a contained environment, or an environment that's mutually agreed to be safe and secure. My encounter with my neighbour was on the street, but it felt a safe place to become emotionally connected to someone else, and it obviously was the same for him, because he was able to share a little bit about his self. So environment is important, but also I think it's about intent. It's about the intent of where you're aiming to be in your practice. It's about saying to yourself, I'm going to focus on this person. I'm going to put all my effort into really trying to understand this person's frame of reference. I'm not going to be judgmental. I'm not going to come up with the answers or the solutions. I'm just going to let this person be. And I think that there's a philosopher called Buber who talks about the I-thou relationship. You'll hear me talk about this in the podcast a lot. And I and thou, this philosophical position of seeing the other person's humanity, seeing them as a human being of equal value and wonder in the world, is a very, very, very good starting position, Ken.
That unconditional positive regard for another human being. And again, when we speak about unconditional positive regard, and we've covered it in previous podcasts, again, in those foundational skills part of what we do, it's about us looking to ourselves, to be there unconditionally for somebody else with no judgment requires us to really have a look at ourselves of what we hold as our biases in life and our opinions and our likes and our dislikes and our that's right and this is wrong. Putting all of that aside is, and I guess this is why when we're speaking about relational depth, it is something that is most likely to come with experience. The more seasoned you are as a counselor, the more comfortable you are within the sessions, the more, I guess, unconscious competence, where you're not thinking about what I'm doing and how I'm saying it and what they're saying and how I might respond to that, where all of that just melts away and becomes almost second nature. It is more of an environment where we may see that relational depth occurring. And I'm reading from the handout here, because I'm cheating. I've got a super duper handout that Rory made that I use for my research when we're preparing for our topic. So relational depth may be hampered by the therapist kind of holding some control over the clients, trying to lead the client in a certain area, in a certain direction, in a certain way. In other words, having an agenda, holding an agenda. We got to get this client fixed. We got to get this client to that point. I really want this breakthrough for the client. Holding those kind of agendas can get in the way of that relational depth. The therapist meeting their own needs out of the process, attempting to fix the client, focusing on the theory, focusing on the skills rather than that present moment magic. And that kind of, I guess, from the handout are some of the things that we want to avoid. And if you're interested in getting the handout, it's free and it's pretty comprehensive. It's a good handout. And you'll get that by going to counsellingtutor.com, because that's our website. And when you're on the website, right at the top, you'll notice there's like a menu bar. Click on the podcasts tab, go and find episode 213 right there on that page, free handout on relational depth that you can download.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it should be taught as a basis of therapy. And I remember many years ago giving a demonstration of relational depth. And I said to my students, I'm going to try it was a student, I'm going to try to help and to nourish relational depth in a small interaction I had with another student as a demonstration. And I remember at the end of it, we were very, very silent for a period of time. So relational depth isn't about specifically skills or verbal communication. We sat in silence for a number of minutes, just connected. And here's the thing, when I snapped out of the student's frame of reference and back into the room, I looked round and it was completely silent. The whole room was completely silent. And I said to the student, I said, just take a few seconds, just sit yourself down and just bring yourself back. And interestingly enough, a few years later, and I'm talking a good 6 or 7 years later, I happened to bump into the student and she said to me, I still remember that interaction, Rory. She said it was one of the most meaningful, in-depth interactions I've ever experienced. And here's the thing, we're in a car park in Warrington.
Yeah.
We're in a car park in Warrington. And as we started to talk, you could feel the process, the chime again. And for me, in that case, I had to get on with my day, and I acknowledged, where she was, and I acknowledged the experience for both of us, and then I moved on. But it would have been very easy to go back into relational depth again. But in that particular case, it wasn't the appropriate place, and it wasn't the appropriate time. Fascinating, and I think we've talked again and again, Ken, haven't we, about not the modality, the quality of the relationship being the best outcome for clients. And this just really adds, grist to the mill, as we say in the north of England. It really, really does. And I'd encourage you to look it up. If you're a student, look it up. Maybe if you're not being taught it on your courses, ask your tutor, because it really, really makes a difference in practice. Really does.
Well, there you have it. That's our Counselling Foundations, looking at relational depth. Get your handout, counsellingtutor.com podcast tab, episode 213. It's there for you to download. Moving away from those foundations now into that focus on self, where we recognize that we, as the therapists, we kind of are the heart, the beating heart of our practice. From the moment you practice simulated skills, it's you, and it's you kind of I guess flexing your practice muscles right through to that last second we spend with our last client. We're in practice, and we are part of that. And when we look to ourselves, I guess the word failure, which I wrote down here, Rory, and I know that we can attribute that maybe to an assignment that's been put in, or any element of our lives. It can really hit us hard, and we all experience failure in one form or another as we go through the arc of our lives. And being able to be there with a client with that cloud, I guess, how do we manage that?
Well, as I always used to say, fail means first attempt in learning. So, and I'm mindful of the quote that's attributed to Thomas Edison, who made the light bulb. Someone said to him, what's it like to make 1,000 light bulbs that don't work? And he said, I haven't. He said, I've got 1,000 different ways of not making a light bulb. So the first thing is your perception of it. If you fail or don't achieve something, I think sometimes it's easy to fall back and think I've failed, I'm hopeless, I'm useless, and da. I think a more stoic position is to say, well, that's one attempt, and what have I learned from that attempt, and where do we go? And you think of any great endeavor, and I was thinking the other day of the moon landings. They had failures along the way, and eventually in 1969, on June the 7th, I think it was, we all, those of us who are alive in 1969, watched the moon landing. And that was due to the fact that people learned from things that didn't go right. And I think that is a very, very good position to take. It's never nice to not achieve something, or put your best work in, work really hard to find out it's not paid off. But I think that the success is picking yourself up and saying, I'm going to have another go. I now know what didn't go correctly. And now I can alter that, and I can start again. And it's not how often you fall down, it's how often you pick yourself up. And I think I might be paraphrasing Rocky Balboa in Rocky, one of the Rocky films.
Yeah.
But it's how often, it's not how hard you get hit. It's not how hard you can hit. It's how hard you can get hit and keep going forward. And I think it's a parable for life, really.
Yeah. It's an interesting one for me, because the word failure I think culturally, and I'm speaking about my frame of reference of that word culturally, is a negative word. It's a negative connotation that is attributed to that. And I think of going back to my school years, where the worst thing that you could get is a fail. It would be written in red pen on your submission. It would be circled, and there would be an F that was circled, and that was failure. You it was like you've done something really bad, and I certainly took that as a message into my life, that the word failure means you've done something bad. And through self-exploration and kind of living some life, I needed to redefine what that word is for me, because I fail all the time.
Yes.
I fail all the time. In the building of Counselling Tutor, Rory and I have failed so many times. We do it almost on a daily basis. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're watching this podcast on our YouTube feed, I'll share with you, we had a failure right in the beginning. We went and edited it out, so you're not going to see it. But what did we do? We took it out and we carried on. It's failing is part of a process of finding the right way. Think about it of being in a maze. If you're in a maze, you're stuck in the middle of a maze and you're trying to get out of the maze. Every time you hit one of those dead ends, you go, it's definitely not this way. And you've learned something from that, as opposed to, oh no, this is not the way out again. Oh no, I'm such a failure. And we can take that on board. And I like how you started, Rory, where you said it's about your relationship with that word. And I challenge you, what is your relationship with that word failure? How does it feel for you when something doesn't go as we expect it to? Because we kind of link in what we expect, and our own expectations are maybe not met because there's some kind of challenge or barrier that stands in the way. We put a label on it. We say, I am a failure. And that is a heavy burden to carry, Rory.
Oh, it's a very heavy burden, and it's one that should be put down immediately, one that should be dismissed immediately. I think the best teachers of how to get past adversity are small children. And I was in the park with my grandson, who's 5, and he was climbing up a rope swing or a rope ladder to get to a slide. And he had about 20 attempts to get up, and he'd get up and then he'd fall. And then at one point we had to climb up and get him down because he couldn't get down. and I said to my wife, just leave him. He will find his way. And he just kept going back and back and back and back. And at no point did we say to him, you failed to get up. We said, you need, have another go. Just have another go. And eventually got to the top, and I can still see him now stood at the top like this. And we're saying, hold on, but it teaches us that actually we might need to make lots of attempts at things before we actually get to our destination. And the learning in those attempts is so valuable. If you get to your destination and there's no resistance, the question is, what have you learned?
Yeah.
What have you learned?
I like that. And for me, my motto is one more try. Just one more try. Just one. And if that doesn't work, just one more try, because there's not a massive commitment in just trying it one more time. No. When you think I'm going to keep on doing this until I get it right, that can look like, I'm sure when Edison was making that light bulb, if they'd have said, this is how many times you have to try to get this right, he might have maybe reconsidered or wobbled a bit, but he was doing it one try at a time. And it's the same with us, it's just one more try. And so many things are left one try away from greatness. And there's a great book that I love. It's called the War of Art. So that I always have to think when I say that, because there's another one called The Art of War. It's not Sun Tzu, The Art of War. It's called The War of Art, and the author escapes me at the moment. We'll put it in the show notes. But in the War of Art, the whole message is that between you and some kind of positive outcome that's going to make a real difference in the world, there is a block, and that block is resistance. And we have to go through resistance. Anything good that we do in life, we've got to go through a period of resistance to be able to get to it, to earn that right to go there. We kind of show our worthiness by going through that resistance. And I think not making it through, you don't know how close you are to the end. And I'll share a story that came from a recent peer group meeting that I had, where a peer shared that he took his daughter to a maze, one of these maze, and it was hay bales maze. And she was very, very little. And he could see over the hay bales, so he could see exactly how this maze was working out. But he was letting his daughter lead the way, and she eventually got to a point where she says, "You know what, Daddy? I don't want to do this anymore. I can't find the way out." And he was standing there, and he could see that the way out was round the next corner. Round the next corner, he could see that.
Yeah.
And he picked her up and he put her on his shoulders, and he said, "Have a look." And she said, "Oh, there's the way out right over there, Daddy." She was really one turn away from the way out. And he used that opportunity to say, never give up. Always give it one more try, because you never know how close you are to that breakthrough. So one more try, that's my motto in life, Rory.
It's a great story. And this comes up a lot in our Facebook page, doesn't it, Ken? We have a lot of people who come into our Facebook page and say, I've tried this maybe in my counselling business and I've failed at that, or my assignments failed. And, we're such a supportive group. And if you want to join our Facebook group, it's Counselling Tutor in Facebook. Just type it in, knock on the door of a closed group. Our wonderful, caring moderation team will let you in. Join the thousands of like-minded people studying, qualified practitioners, supervisors, and a soup song of tutors that are in our group, and and interact. And you will see. And one of the wonderful things I think, Ken, about the Facebook group is you'll see people saying, "I'm really struggling. And all of a sudden they'll say, "I've kept going, I've persevered, and I've done it."
Yeah.
And the question any good teacher asks, I think, is, "What have you learned? What have you learned from that?" And that is the most important thing. The learning between attempting and not getting there and attempting and getting there is what you take on to the next thing in life that you approach.
I like it. There's nothing more to say on it. That's a beautiful way to to put a full stop at the end of our focus on self. And we now move swiftly into practice matters, where we look at an element of practice. So if you're a qualified practitioner, it might be an element of running your practice on a day-to-day basis. It may be a presentation, somebody that may come to you and something that they may bring, or it may be a technique or a way of working. And today it is a technique, way of working, and it's about role play in therapy, or role play games within therapy, from Daniel Hand. Now, Daniel, you met up with Daniel. He did an interview. What can we expect from this, Rory?
Well, I mean, my interest was piqued because there was an article in the January 2022 BACP Today on that Daniel had written about role-playing games, things like Dungeons and Dragons. That would be a role-playing game, how they're used in therapy. And I thought, I like people who plow new ground. I like people who think out of the box, plow new ground, because every client is different and we need to meet the clients where they're at. So I got in contact with Daniel, and he spoke about the use of role-playing games in therapy, and how he's developing this idea. It's not his own idea, but he's developing this idea, and the research and the outcomes that he has. And this is what he had to say. And we welcome Daniel Hand, who is an author, illustrator, and games designer. He's an integrative counsellor in private practice. And interestingly, he has come up with a new idea in therapy, which is called RPG therapy. So, first of all, Daniel, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. I've been listening to you ever since the dark days of my own training, and never thought I'd be here myself. So thank you for inviting me along.
Well, there you go. And RPG therapy, what is RPG therapy?
RPG therapy is essentially therapy making use of RPGs, funnily enough. An RPG or a role-playing game or a tabletop role-playing game or a pen and paper role-playing game or any other phrase you want to use basically involves a group of people, usually 5 or 6, sitting around a table, making up stories, creating characters, going on adventures, rolling lots and lots of dice. I won't show you my dice collection here, but it is rather terrifying. One thing I do say to people who are interested in coming into RPGs is you'll reach the stage where the only reason you can't find your dice is because they're under your other dice. And once you've got your ridiculous amount of dice, you've created your characters, you go out into some fictional worlds and slay dragons. If you think of Lord of the Rings, you've got to find the ring and take it and drop it into the pit of lava. If you think of the Chronicles of Narnia, you've got to go and kill the White Witch. If you want to do something science fiction-y, then you can go on the Starship Enterprise and stop a war between the Romulans and the Klingons. You can do pretty much anything in RPGs, and if you can do pretty much anything in RPGs, then it's magic for therapy.
I think what's really interesting, you've had an article published in BACP magazine in the December 2021-22 entitled "Battling Demons," and I think one of the things that I picked up on is you say to the players, these exercises are nothing less than an escape from the real world, a chance for them to become whoever and do whatever they wish, no matter how impossible, daft or morally questionable these things may be. How does using a game of dice and a role-playing game facilitate the therapeutic kind of movement, Daniel?
Well, just to pick up on something you said a little while ago, you said that I'd invented this. I would love to claim responsibility for it, but I'm afraid there are a few therapists over in the United States who've been doing it for a little while. But we each have our own different approaches to it. But I think the common thread that you'll have going through all of it is you can take this client, and they can be of any age. I've got an 11-year-old client, and I've got a client in their 50s. You can put them in a situation where everything's at arm's length. So if they're being bullied, for example, well, they're not being bullied, the character is being bullied, and they can see, okay, well, what's the character doing? What would you say to the character? What do you think the character's feeling? How are you feeling? And by giving that arm's length, it grants that little bit of freedom to make mistakes. And you'll know as much as I that 99.9% of clients are absolutely terrified of making mistakes.
Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting one, because what I'm hearing is that the client can live kind of vicariously through the character and could express emotions, make mistakes, take actions that maybe they struggle to do in real time.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the phrases I use in the article is that players can literally get away with murder. I mean, I'm not saying I would encourage your client to go around killing every character they see. That might hint at deeper problems than they've come to counselling initially for. But if, for example, they were to kill somebody in the game, the police aren't going to come knocking because this isn't real. You'd explore it. You'd look at, okay, well, how do you think the character felt doing that? What would you say to the character in these situations? But the danger of punishment, isn't there, there'll be consequences. If you do your job properly, there'll be consequences in the game. For example, you might meet the deceased's family later on, but they're not going to be hauled off and the key thrown away. And that can be in anything. I mean, I think I used this client as an example in the article, but there was one young man I met years ago. He described to me at one stage how it had taken him half an hour to decide whether or not he wanted to eat a banana or an apple. And, a crippling fear of making decisions. Well, that RPGs are perfect for that, because you can make any number of decisions and see, well, actually, the world hasn't ended. The sky's up there. And that gives you practice. You can just practice making decisions. You can see, well, that person made this decision. Does that mean I can make my decision? And you can both learn through the character, but you can also start to kind of become your character, which is very exciting to watch.
I think that's really interesting. The fact that people can find the person they are through vicariously integrating with other characters. One of the things I really picked up on, and something I've had a little interest in, is the idea of storytelling as a communal activity. Stephen Fry, the author, broadcaster, mentioned this in a recent interview, and saying that we've lost the art really of storytelling, sitting around the communal fire telling stories. And I just want to pick up on that idea of, as a therapeutic intervention, being able to tell a story and make sense of our world within it.
Oh, well, first, you're going to have to signpost me to that interview, because A, Stephen Fry is amazing, and B, Stephen Fry talking about stories. Yes, please, I'm in. Yes, and storytelling is one of the oldest, if not perhaps the oldest, quote-unquote profession in existence. I mean, RPGs, as currently understood as an industry, have only existed for about 50 years, but they're really just a continuation of this age-old practice of people getting together and telling stories about literally anything. They can be fairy tales, they can be stories told to teach lessons, they can be religious, they can be mythological. I mean, obviously, the oldest extant narrative we have is all about what we would call mythology, but to the authors was history. This is how the world came into being. And without stories, A, we lose our place in the cosmos, if you want to call it that. I mean, if, just to get political for an absolute bare minimum of a moment, if more people were open to telling each other stories about politics, be they, I don't know, Brexit or the coronavirus, for example, or presidential elections, we'd get on a lot better. We'd learn to understand what people are talking about and where they're coming from. The word, I'm sure it begins with E, empathy, empath. It'll come to me.
Yes, I'm sure it will. I'm sure there's lots of people listening going, it's empathy. It's empathy, Daniel.
Empathy. Yeah, that's the one. And that, so storytelling as an art form has always been about listening to others, learning from others, and teaching others. And the RPG side of things continues that as a tradition, but it also allows the tellers to actually get into the narrative themselves. It's the equivalent of a first-person narrative in a book, as opposed to a third person.
Yes, and I think what's I'm picking up again and again from the article is that there's a real link to narrative in this. And I know that one of the more postmodern approaches now is narrative therapy. I wonder, do you think that as part of your integrative approach, that there is a narrative therapeutic element to working with RPGs?
Yes and no. I confess I'm not fully kosher with narrative therapy in its entirety. As I understand it, narrative therapy is more along the lines of taking the perceived downhill parts of your life and rewriting them as uphill parts of your life. Whereas this is more of taking an entirely separate narrative and learning from that, if that makes sense. It's
yes.
I had something then, but deep and meaningful, but I'm afraid it's gone.
Well, there you go. That happens to us all. Tell me, Daniel, how do the clients react to this kind of approach? What do they say after you've maybe worked on a series of therapeutic engagements with them using this approach? What's their views? What's their feedback?
I'm trying to think if I've ever had an experience and I don't think I have, other than, oh my God, this is amazing. Can we do it again next week? Well,
yes. I mean, I think the client's views should always be taken into account, and I think that's quite an endorsement of what you're doing, isn't it? If a client's saying that to you,
absolutely. And I always get a bit nervous when I'm starting to do it with some clients, just because I'm thinking, well, this is all. I'm making this up, aren't I? Surely I'm sure it happened well last week, but yeah, it's not going to happen well this week, is it? Come on. And just seeing the joy and the wonder on these clients' faces, and we're talking anything from young child to fully grown adult. I've worked with army veterans with RPGs, and almost word for word the same response. It's just, I mean, the language is a bit more adult, shall we say, but because I think the thing that a lot of the clients get out of it is it's just fun. That there's no such thing as a real dragon, but who cares? You're imagining taking out your magical Vorpal sword and slicing its wing off. It's cool. This is why people go to the cinema to watch Marvel films, because it's just of an epic nature that you can lose yourself in.
Yes. And I guess people can experiment with different ways of being as well within that. If they're projecting them onto a character, then they can see how that fits for them, and what feelings come up for them.
Yeah, very much so. And that word projection is, I think, pretty much the heart of the whole, as well as that other E word that I couldn't think of earlier. Part of the whole crux of the intervention, because if you can, I mean, we've all been to a film and kind of imagined ourselves as a character, and there's an entire generation out there raised on imagining that they're Iron Man or Captain America, and that is therapeutic. I mean, everything about life. The longer I'm in this particular profession, I realize that everything about life is therapeutic in some way, shape, or form. And our roles as counselors is to tap into that. And in this particular case, rolling dice and imagining that you're Iron Man fighting War Machine.
Indeed. So if there's anybody, if the listener listening to this is interested in developing their practice along the lines of role-playing games, where would be a good starting point for them to get some information?
The horribly mercenary plug, by all means, visit my website. I offer training CPD sessions to help you integrate some RPG work into your practice, but also go to your local game shop. Board games and role-play games are making a big comeback, so you will have a dedicated game shop somewhere nearby. Go there. The staff will be overjoyed to talk you through whichever role-play game you want to play. You've got Dungeons and Dragons, you've got Lord of the Rings games, you've got Quest, you've got Spire, you've got Marvel games. I've recently purchased one that's all about secret agents fighting vampires. So, there's something for everybody. Find what interests you, read up, dive in, really.
Well, Daniel, we will put links to your website and your resources in our show notes. So, Daniel Hand, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you, as always, to Daniel Hand for that amazing interview. Really interesting. And thank you again to you, Rory, because you kind of hosted that, and you're always taking your time to meet with people, to seek out the right people to bring to our audience. And I hope that you got some value from that. And of course, if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to dig a little bit deeper into what Daniel was talking about, Daniel is doing a lecture for our Counselling CPD library. It's for qualified practitioners. If you're a qualified practitioner, you want to join our Counsellor CPD library, just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information you need is right there on that page. And there it is, Rory. This has been episode 213, our first podcast, history in the making, that has gone out both audibly and, of course, on our new YouTube channel, Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Absolutely. And what interesting topics. We started off looking at the Mick Cooper, Dave Mearns ideas on relational depth and connection and how we use that in therapy and indeed our own life. We talked about failure in a number of areas and how we deal with failure and work through it. And then finally, we had an interview with Daniel Hand, breaking new ground by using role-playing games in therapy. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.